All right, we have a factory frame 4-link truck here that I thought I would do an install video on. We just finished this one up, and I'm just gonna kind of start from the beginning and tell you where to start and some of the things that are important to pay attention to. So obviously the first thing to do is to get the frame completely cleaned off. Get rid of all of your factory shock mounts, getting the axle cleaned up. That's a pretty big undertaking in itself, getting all the brackets off of the axle. That way you don't have anything in your way and you can get a really nice clean install. But once you get everything cleaned up, the first thing to do is to kind of determine the ride height of the truck. So on this one, we don't have an engine in it, so we know the truck is sitting probably an inch or two higher than what it will once the engine is in it. So we kind of took that into consideration. We just set the truck level, but we know that we're 1.5 inches higher than what we will be at ride height once the engine is in it. Typically, if you have the truck at ride height, as a rule, you want the bottom of the frame side bracket to be the same height as the bottom of your axle bracket. This truck we know is sitting a little bit higher right now, so we have this about 1.5 inches higher than the bottom of the axle bracket. So that's how you set the height of your frame side bracket. As far as setting front to back is fairly simple. Typically you have your bump stop mounts that locates the original position of the axle fairly well, but it's also not a bad idea to, before you pull your axle out and do any disassembly, come up here off of the cab mounts. The cab mounts are a pretty good square reference point that you can measure off of, and pull yourself a measurement from there back to your axle so that you can get the axle back in the position that it belongs. So once you have those measurements and you're ready to put everything back together, we typically start with the axle brackets first. We'll weld up all the doublers. Usually what we'll do is we'll take a chunk out of the front of the brackets so that the brackets can slide on from the back. And then once you have all of that back in place, you can put that piece back in and you can weld everything in place. So the first thing to do is to establish, your overall width. We typically like to put these in the space that the factory leaf spring would have used originally. So we like to go outside of the frame. I have seen guys do them inside of the frame as well. That way isn't wrong either if that's the way you chose to do it. We like to do it outside of the frame because it gets kind of full inside by the time you get the anti-roll bar and the shocks and everything else put in there. It just seems to kind of spread things out a little bit better and make it easier to lay everything out nice. So once you have your width set, you want to get your axle brackets squared up really nice. And typically we will take these and make the face of them square with the face of the pinion. Typically you're going to want about 2 degrees of negative pinion angle. That is the drive shaft in relation to the pinion. And on most of these trucks, the drive shaft does end up running uphill some. So if you set the pinion at 0 in relation to the ground, that's usually a pretty good starting point. And then you can fine tune it with your heim joint adjustments after you have everything built and you're doing your final fine tuning of everything. So once you have your axle brackets fastened, from there, we will put our 4-link bars together, and you can actually use the axle with the brackets and the 4-link bars and your front brackets attached to that, and you can kind of roll it all in place to get that positioning in the truck. There's a couple different ways you can do that. If you'd rather just do it by measuring, that's fine as well. So typically on these frame side brackets, once again, we'll go ahead and we'll weld up the doublers, and then we'll bolt heim joints in place, and we'll get the boxing plate, we'll get that welded on as well. And then once you have that done, you can cut your bottom support tube to the right width, and you can get the brackets welded to that tube. That allows you to, on the table, you can make sure that these brackets are square to this tube here, and you have everything to the right width and everything. You can even go ahead and weld these stubs onto here if you would like, and then it's just a matter of bringing it to the truck and sliding it all into place. Once you have your measurements double check. Once again, you can come off of the cab mounts as a good reference point, come back, just make sure you have everything square. These brackets, once again, you want to have them perfectly plumb, squared up to the truck. So fairly straightforward as to where to position those. You can see here how we typically do the lower support. We have one bar running all the way across, and then I like to bring the lower kicker from straight in front of the brackets into the frame. So that makes a little bit of an angled bar here, but it does make it a lot stronger here rather than running this straight back. I have done it before, or have seen it done, where this bar comes straight back and hits the bar here, and then putting a gusset in this corner. That can be done as well. But then we also put this corner gusset pipe in. Typically we like to run that in close to where the wishbone will mount to, so that gives that extra rigidity in there as well. From there, you have the option of doing a wishbone or a track bar. This truck, we have a wishbone in it. We did the 2 mount points on the truck and 1 on the axle. That's my preferred way of doing it. We have a tube connecting 4-link brackets from side to side, so that gives you some reinforcement on the 4-link bracket, gives you a really nice mount point under the pumpkin to fasten your wishbone to. I do not like to rely on welds to the cast center section. I don't know, I don't feel as good about welding to cast and relying on that. We do weld to cast some, but usually try to use that as a reinforcement weld and not the only weld versus, you know, running a reinforcement bar to do your main structural support. Although we don't have a track bar in this truck, I'll talk about it a little bit. If you choose to go with a track bar instead of a wishbone, typically that will be located right straight on top of the axle. Usually we will put our track bar mount on the axle tube about right here, and it would come up to here, and then the tube would run across to the frame right in here. You want to try to get that bar as flat as possible. So the closer you can get that bar to flat, the less side-to-side movement you will have as it moves through its range of motion. So track bar is not quite as ideal as a wishbone, but a track bar is a perfectly serviceable way of doing it. It's easier, it's less expensive than what a wishbone would be, so it's kind of up to you as to which way you decide to go there. This is an anti-roll bar, heavy-duty anti-roll bar kit that we sell. It has a 2-inch chromoly main tube, and this one here is mounted on our tube mount. So we also sell a frame mount style mount, where it just has like a sheet metal mount that goes to the frame here, and these cups weld directly to it to where you don't have to run a tube across. So really that's just personal preference and what works best in your project. As far as setting the length for the link bars and setting these arms, on this truck we set these down fairly low because it's going to have a bed on it, and we wanted to make sure that these arms don't come up and hit the bed floor when you compress the suspension. So typically you want to shoot for having these things close to level at ride height. As you can see here, these point down some. That is also not uncommon. The main thing is you need to make sure that these things never max out in range of movement. As long as you have some angle in the bar at full droop, you should be fine there. Shock mounting, once again, is fairly basic. Make sure you have them as close to squared up and vertical as you can get. Run a tube across. Here we have tabs running back. Depending on your ride height situation, sometimes you can get those under the bar. Like it really just depends on different situations, but the main thing is that your shock gets mounted, you know, as close to vertical as possible. So that kind of gives you the basic rundown of how we do a 4-link install. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot us a message or anything, but that should get you well on the way to getting a solid install done on a factory frame 4-link.